Ships turned back before reaching their target. Survivors told stories not of defeat, but of terror, a kind of fear the Vikings had never known. This is the story of the only tribe that made the Vikings afraid. The Vikings were not like other warriors. They did not fight for land, for glory, or even for wealth alone. They fought because battle was their destiny. From a young age, boys were trained to wield axes, swords, and shields. They were taught that courage in battle was the measure of a man. To hesitate was to bring shame upon yourself and your family. Their reputation was legendary. Tales of their raids spread across Europe, carried by merchants, monks, and terrified villagers alike. They struck swiftly, often under the cover of night, and disappeared just as fast. No army could match their ferocity, no city could withstand their fury. Vikings were living storms, and they knew it. Death held no power over them. The concept of fear was foreign. Even when outnumbered, even when facing fortified towns, Vikings pressed forward. Their confidence was absolute because they believed that dying in combat was not an end. It was a beginning. Valhalla awaited those who fell bravely, and the thought of that eternal reward made them unstoppable. Yet this very fearlessness, this confidence in battle and death, would become the measure by which they were tested. For the enemy they were about to face did not fight like any other. This was a force that did not seek glory or honor. They did not meet Vikings in open combat, and they did not grant the promise of a noble death. And that, above all else, was what terrified the Vikings more than any weapon or shield could. The Vikings had explored far and wide, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the bustling cities of England, Ireland, and even as far as the Mediterranean. Yet beyond the lands they had raided for decades lay territories few had dared to enter. Lands shrouded in mystery, filled with dense forests, winding rivers, and swamps that seemed to go on forever. These were regions the Vikings called the unknown, and even they felt the weight of uncertainty when venturing into them. Unlike the familiar towns and villages where merchants could be looted and kings negotiated with, these lands offered no easy targets. There were no fortresses to storm, no armies to crush, no treasures to plunder, only nature and its silent inhabitants. The forests were alive with shadows. Rivers twisted like serpents, hiding dangers beneath their calm surface, and the winds carried whispers of people who did not fight by the rules the Vikings understood. It was here, at the very edge of their known world, that the Vikings first encountered stories of a tribe unlike any they had faced. Tales spread of warriors who disappeared into the trees as if swallowed by the forest itself, leaving no trace behind. Some who returned from these lands spoke of strange signs in the night, flashes of movement, fires that appeared and vanished, and the haunting feeling of being watched. For the first time, the Vikings felt something they could not conquer with axes or shields. They felt uncertainty, they felt fear, and in those silent, shadowed forests at the edge of their maps, the rules of battle and bravery they had lived by for generations suddenly seemed irrelevant. The unknown had become more dangerous than any army they had ever faced. Beyond the forests and rivers that marked the edge of Viking exploration lived a people unlike any the raiders had ever seen. They were not kings, not organized armies, not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were a tribe of hunters, warriors, and survivors, perfectly adapted to the land they called home. To the Vikings, they seemed almost invisible, appearing and disappearing like shadows in the mist. These people knew the terrain in ways the Vikings could never hope to understand. Every river bend, every hidden grove, every path through the dense forest was mapped in their minds. They moved silently, leaving no tracks, no fires, no signals for the enemy to follow. Their villages were hidden, their numbers unknown, and their tactics entirely foreign. For outsiders, it was as if the land itself was alive, defending them. What made them truly terrifying, however, was not just their knowledge of the land, but their approach to combat. They did not seek open battle. They did not fight for honor, glory, or conquest. Instead, they struck swiftly, vanished without a trace, and allowed fear itself to become their weapon. Where the Vikings thrived on chaos and the clashing of axes, this tribe thrived in silence, patience, and the unseen. Even the stories that reached Viking ears were enough to make the boldest warriors hesitate. Survivors spoke of shadows moving through the trees, of sudden ambushes from places no one could hide, of enemies who seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving nothing but fear in their wake. These were not ordinary foes. They were an entirely different kind of threat, one that the Vikings were ill-prepared to face. The Vikings were masters of open battle. Their strength lay in formation, in the clash of shields and axes, in the roar of men moving as one unstoppable force. They thrived where the battlefield was clear, where warriors could see one another, and where courage and strength decided the outcome. Their tactics were simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective, until they met this tribe. This enemy fought in ways the Vikings could not understand. They did not line up in rows or meet their foes in direct combat. Instead, they melted into the forests, the rivers, and the swamps, striking where no one expected, then disappearing as quickly as they came. Ambushes happened at dawn, at dusk, even in the dead of night. The tribe's attacks were precise, almost surgical, targeting supply lines, scouts, and isolated groups. There was no glory, no open confrontation, only fear, confusion, and chaos. The Vikings tried to adapt, but their strength became a weakness. Shield walls and tight formations that had crushed countless armies were useless when the enemy struck unseen from every side. Axes and swords swung blindly at shadows, while arrows fell from above with deadly accuracy. Every engagement left the Vikings off balance, exhausted, and questioning what was real and what was imagined. It was not just the physical attacks that unnerved them, it was the psychological warfare. This tribe did not need to kill many to win. It was enough to appear, vanish, and make the Vikings feel constantly watched. The forests themselves seemed to conspire against the raiders, hiding enemies at every turn and turning their own confidence into fear. For the first time in their lives, the Vikings realized that brute strength and courage could not guarantee survival. The first encounters were brief, almost surreal. Viking raiding parties ventured into the dense forests, expecting to find villages or small settlements, ready to plunder as they always had. But the land seemed empty. Fires were cold. Houses were abandoned, or so it appeared. At first, the Vikings laughed. It was too quiet, too easy. They were confident, as they always were. Then the attacks began. Silent arrows whistled through the trees. Shadows darted across their path, never fully seen, never fully understood. Scouts disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the terrified cries of their comrades. Men were cut off from the group, falling in silence, their deaths known only by the sudden absence of their voices. Every step deeper into the forest brought uncertainty, and every shadow felt like an enemy waiting to strike. The Vikings tried to retaliate, to fight back as they always had. They charged, axes raised, shouting war cries meant to intimidate. But there was nothing to strike. The tribe did not meet them in battle. They appeared on the flanks, in the treetops, behind fallen logs, then vanished again. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, protecting its warriors and punishing intruders. By the time the first parties returned to their ships, the stories they carried were whispered, not shouted. Not about bravery or loot or victory, but about fear. A new kind of fear. A fear that gnawed at their confidence, at their belief that they were unstoppable. Vikings, the fearless raiders of Europe, had met something they could not fight head-on. And for the first time, they questioned whether stepping foot in that land was worth the cost. What truly unsettled the Vikings was not the tribe's weapons or numbers. It was the way they used fear itself as a weapon. These were not traditional battles where courage and strength could decide the outcome. Instead, every moment in the forest, every movement, every rustle of leaves became a potential threat. The Vikings could not predict where the enemy would strike, nor could they anticipate how they would disappear again, leaving nothing behind but silence. Nightfall became a time of dread. Fires that had always offered comfort now drew attention, becoming targets for unseen arrows. Shadows seemed to move with intention. The slightest sound, a cracking branch, a whispered wind, was enough to send warriors into panic. Men who had faced death countless times now feared being watched, hunted, and outsmarted in ways that no amount of skill could counter. Even the strongest warriors began to question themselves. What kind of enemy could appear from nowhere, vanish at will, and strike without mercy? What kind of opponent could make the Vikings, men who had conquered cities, toppled kings, and laughed at death, pause in fear? The answer was simple, one that played by no rules, one that fought in ways the Vikings had never encountered, and one that thrived on uncertainty as much as on blades. Fear spread faster than arrows. It seeped into camps, whispers echoing among men. No songs of victory were sung, no tales of glory were told. The only story was of shadows, silence, and the constant haunting sense that the enemy was always just beyond sight. In this way, the tribe turned the Viking mind against itself, creating a battlefield where courage no longer mattered and terror ruled supreme. As stories of the tribe spread among the Viking communities, fear grew faster than any arrow or sword could. Survivors returned with tales that were whispered rather than shouted, their voices trembling as they described shadows moving through trees, fires that appeared and vanished without explanation, and warriors who seemed to disappear into thin air. Each retelling added a new layer of mystery, turning reality into legend. The Vikings, who had once laughed at death and danger, now hesitated at every forest edge. Rumors spread that this tribe could vanish into the mist, that they were protected by spirits of the land, or that the forest itself conspired against intruders. Even the bravest raiders began to wonder if stepping into these territories meant facing forces beyond human understanding. The tales became a mix of fact and exaggeration, creating a mythology that haunted Viking imaginations. Names and events were whispered around campfires, often more frightening than anything the men had actually seen. Fear, once foreign to their culture, became a constant companion. The Vikings were learning that an enemy need not be stronger or larger to conquer. They only had to make their presence impossible to ignore. By the time these stories reached the ears of other Viking leaders, caution had replaced confidence. Strategies were reconsidered, raids postponed, and some areas left untouched entirely. In this way, the tribe didn't need to fight thousands of battles. The legend of their unpredictability and cunning was enough to halt even the fiercest warriors. The Vikings were unmatched in open combat, but in the dense forests, rivers, and swamps of this territory, their greatest strengths became weaknesses. Shield walls and tightly packed formations, so effective on open fields, were useless in terrain that restricted movement and hid enemies at every turn. Their axes and swords, designed for clear strikes against visible foes, often met only empty air or struck at shadows that vanished before the blow landed. Supplies and logistics also became a nightmare. The Vikings were used to raiding villages, taking provisions and moving quickly. In these lands, food was scarce, water was hidden, and every step deeper into the forest made them vulnerable. Scouts disappeared. Horses and ships became liabilities in places where the enemy controlled every path. What had been a simple matter of planning and strength now required constant vigilance, patience, and luck. Things the Vikings had rarely depended on before. The tribe's knowledge of the land was absolute. They could strike from any direction, using rivers, hills, and thick forests to their advantage. The Vikings' familiar tactics, confidence, and speed were neutralized. Every raid became a gamble, with unknown risks. By the time the Vikings recognized the patterns, fear had already taken hold. They understood that survival required more than courage. It demanded respect for an enemy they could not see, predict, or confront on equal terms. In the end, it was not brute force that failed them. It was the inability to fight by the rules of this strange and unseen opponent. For the first time, the Vikings realized that some battles could not be won through skill, strength, or valor alone. Some enemies fought with the land itself, and some victories were decided before a blade was ever drawn. Over time, the line between reality and legend began to blur. Stories of the tribe grew with each retelling, shadows that could vanish into thin air, warriors who struck without warning, and forests that seemed alive. To the Vikings, these tales were terrifying, but to historians, they reveal an important truth. Myths often arise when the ordinary rules of warfare no longer apply. The tribe was not supernatural. They were human, like the Vikings, with strengths and weaknesses shaped by their environment. What made them so effective was not magic or monsters. It was knowledge, strategy, and patience. They mastered the terrain, understood the limits of the enemy, and turned fear itself into a weapon. Legends exaggerated the details, but the core truth remained. This was a force the Vikings could not predict or control. Separating fact from fiction helps us understand why the Vikings, fearsome conquerors elsewhere, failed here. The attacks were real, the ambushes terrifying, and the psychological impact undeniable. Yet much of the horror was amplified by the stories carried back to Viking settlements, stories that grew longer and darker with each telling. By the time they reached the ears of other leaders, the tribe had become almost mythic in their abilities. The lesson is clear. History remembers conquerors, but it also remembers fear. Sometimes fear shapes behavior more than swords or shields ever could. The myths tell us as much about the Vikings and their worldview as they do about the tribe itself, revealing a profound truth. Humans are often most defeated by what they cannot understand. The story of this tribe is more than a tale of ambushes and vanished warriors. It is a lesson in understanding the limits of power. The Vikings were strong, fearless, and relentless, but even they could be outmatched by knowledge, patience, and strategy. Strength alone cannot overcome an enemy who knows the land, the rules, and the mind of their opponent better than you do. This tribe did not need to fight countless battles. They did not need to conquer cities or take gold. Their victories came from restraint, observation, and the careful use of fear. By denying the Vikings what they valued most, certainty, control, and a warrior's glory, they achieved a power that armies often fail to understand, the power of the unseen. History often remembers the victors, the empires, and the conquerors. Yet the most profound victories are sometimes the quiet ones, fought not with blood and steel, but with intelligence and patience. The Vikings may have been the most feared warriors of their age, but in the shadowed forests of this tribe, they learned what it felt like to be hunted, to be uncertain, to be afraid. In the end, this is a story about respect, for enemies, for the land, and for the idea that not all battles are won by force. Some are won by understanding, by strategy, and by the subtle mastery of fear itself. And perhaps, in that lesson, there is something more powerful than even the mightiest sword. History remembers the Vikings as fearless raiders, unstoppable conquerors who carved their mark across Europe. But it rarely remembers the moments when they hesitated, when they turned back, and when they felt a fear so profound it could not be conquered by sword or shield. In the shadowed forests of this tribe, the Vikings learned a lesson that no battle could teach. Sometimes, the greatest power lies not in force, but in the unknown. The tribe remains largely forgotten by history, their names lost to time, their villages reclaimed by the forest. Yet their legacy lives on in the stories of fear, caution, and respect they inspired in warriors who thought they knew what fear was, and discovered they had never truly felt it until now. They did not seek glory or conquest, but they ensured their survival and commanded respect in a way few empires could. Perhaps this is the deeper truth of history. It is not only the victors who shape the world, but also those who resist in silence, who fight with patience instead of steel, and who remind even the strongest that certainty can be an illusion. The Vikings conquered many lands, but here they were humbled, not by numbers, nor by weapons, but by the cunning, patience, and subtle terror of an enemy they could not see. If you think history is only about who won battles or built empires, think again. Sometimes the most powerful stories are those that history almost forgot, and sometimes the enemies who leave the deepest mark are the ones who never fought a conventional war at all.